Two Chairs No Waiting, episode number 120. Listener feedback, episode number 13. Two Chairs No Waiting is brought to you each week by Weaver's Department Store at weaversdepartmentstore.com. Drop by over at Weaver's and pick up some of your favorite Mayberry items. They've got everything over there. T-shirts, ties, DVDs, they got it all. Drop by over at Weaver's and give it a look. Two Chairs No Waiting is also brought to you by donations from listeners like you. This week's executive producer is Jan Newsom, because she puts up with me. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Alan Newsom, and this is Two Chairs No Waiting, your Mayberry podcast. I hope you're enjoying all of our other episodes. We've got 119 of them in the bag, so you are invited to go back and check them all out, because this week we're going to be hearing from some of you, the listeners, to this podcast. They've written in. Nobody called in. I'd love to hear from you, so if you'd like to call in and get your voice here on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you at 888-684-8415. That phone number is on the twocairsnowaiting.com website, so you can see it in every show notes. It's right there, so just go by and give me a call. But we're going to talk about several of the episodes you may have missed, and if you have, I definitely invite you to go and listen to them. But if you've heard them, I think you'll be interested in some of the things fellow listeners have had to say, rather than just hearing from me all the time. So first up is Richard, who wrote in about episode number 117, Mayberry Party Line, which has been one of the most downloaded or listened to episodes I've ever done. So I'm not sure what it is about party lines that got everybody excited, but the Mayberry Party Line from Richard, here's what he said. He says, my comment is on episode number 117, Mayberry Party Line. That's good, because that's what I'd already said. Anyway, he goes on to say, why would there be payphones with dials in Mayberry? I know of two instances where they show up in the Andy Griffith Show. First, in Miss Ellie Comes to Town, that episode, on the drugstore wall. And then again in Those Gossiping Men, when the women of Mayberry were spreading the gossip over the telephone about Barney's injured finger. That's a good question. I had never, I don't remember anybody ever asking that before, but there are payphones in Mayberry. I've seen them. So how did that work? I guess Sarah, maybe you could still have payphones, but I'm not sure the dial would work, because you would just have to have Sarah, dial them up for you. So, hey, that's something to look at. I will look into that and check that out on some of those two episodes, Richard. And I thank you for writing in with that. And I'm sure some of the other folks may have never noticed this either. So thanks for writing in and commenting on that. We have another comment from that same episode, number 117. And this one's from John. And John wrote in and he said this. He said, great topic, talking about Mayberry Party Lines. He said, I'm like you. I caught the tail end of party line days for the telephones. This was about the same time when phone numbers had letters attached to them. Y'all remember that? They had phone numbers attached that had letters. For instance, our phone number was SK66774. Amazing the things that stick in the memory, is what he said. So back then, his phone number was SK66774. And he goes on to say these things. He says, I think I've always assumed that somehow no one else in town could use the phone while they were on their long distance calls. He's talking about the sisters that were talking on the phone about their feet falling asleep. He said, that's what the show implied. I love how it prompts Mr. Tucker's speech about, you people are living in a different world, in another world. Men are orbiting the earth. He says, I love that episode. And John goes on to say, so many great moments in that one episode. Here's one we have used for years. He says, here's a quote. He's quoting. He says, oh boy, I get to sleep on the ironing board between two chairs. Mr. Tucker says, that sounds awful. No, it ain't. That's adventure sleeping. That line has been used on more camping trips than I could remember.
Oh, rats. If you were staying, I was going to get to sleep on the ironing board between two chairs.
Sounds terrible.
No, it ain't. That's adventure sleeping.
So that's adventure sleeping. Anyway, John, thanks for writing in. Call in next time. I'd love to have your voice on here. But thanks for writing in with those observances. And you're right. That adventure sleeping line, I've used that many times when I had to, if somebody was coming to the house and I had to sleep in the floor for some reason to let them have my bed or whatever reason. That was adventure sleeping. So thanks for that bit of feedback. Now we're going to move on to episode number 119 because I got a good bit of feedback about it as well, which was last week's episode about African Americans in Mayberry. First up is just Larry, and Larry basically just had to say, he said, such a good job on the podcast this week, one of the best ones ever. A Mayberry theme is love for everyone. And so I agree with Larry. It's that's really what it was all about, and that's kind of hope what came across last week in that episode, that it's really just that the people really in Mayberry really cared about each other, and I think that's what I hope came across, and it didn't really matter what color anybody was. I think everybody in Mayberry would have been treated well. We have next up is from Brent. And Brent writes in. And Brent, he's involved in the Three Stooges. So if you go to threestooges.net, spell out threestooges.net, he's involved in that over there. But Brent says, moving ahead a couple of years from that episode, the African Americans in Mayberry, talking about that. Moving ahead a couple of years, Mayberry RFD, the show that followed the Andy Griffith Show, had the recurring character of a farmer, Ralph Burton, who it was Sam Jones' neighbor. He was played by Charles Lampkin. So that was a African-American character that was later on Mayberry RFD, not on the Andy Griffith Show, but Mayberry RFD. So I want to thank Brent for writing in about that. We don't cover Mayberry RFD much on the podcast because, honestly, I have never seen all the episodes, I don't think. Or if I have, it was a long time ago. I don't have those. I'd love to have a copy of all those episodes, but I don't. So, Brent, thanks for writing in with that bit of information. And now we got a couple of things here coming up from Joe Gritton. Well, Joe's a great guy. He's one. If you've listened to some of the older episodes or some of the previous episodes of this podcast, you may have heard the ones about Floyd and Bert, where it's actually a flashback scene between Floyd, the barber, and Bert Miller, the salesman. Oh, those ringing doorbells. That Bert, yes. And Joe was the one who was kind enough to write those scripts for me that we were able to record and do here on the podcast. So we want to thank Joe for that. But Joe had written in also about concerning episode number 119. He says this. He says he'd like to comment on your podcast concerning African Americans. That was a very well done segment. Well, thank you very much, Joe. I didn't read that just for tooting my horn, but I want to tell you guys that I was a little nervous about it. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how that would play. I wasn't sure how that would work because I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Didn't want anybody to feel like I was doing anything I shouldn't do there. But I want to thank all of you that have written me and said it was done well, and I did okay there. So going on, Joe said. You may know that reportedly Oprah Winfrey is a big Andy Griffith Show fan. And she actually had the actor you mentioned, Rodney Tarkington, on her show after someone commented that there were no black people of color in Mayberry. Whenever I think of minorities in Mayberry, and I guess that includes women, according to Barney, I think of Asian Americans because my adopted daughter is Asian. In one sense, it saddens me that they were only used in stereotypical roles of running a Chinese restaurant or doing martial arts. Thank goodness they didn't also run Goss's dry cleaner, as he said. But on the other hand, I understand that this was the 60s. Television of that era just was not as multicultural as it needed to be. The segment inspired me to watch closer because I'm sure there are other Asian Americans in the background as well. That's a good point, Joe, and that's something I haven't watched for either. So everybody that's listening, keep an eye out for Asian Americans that may be on the streets of Mayberry. We'd like to pick those out and show them as well. So you'll see that the town maybe had a diversity there that we just aren't aware of. Remembering that it's just a TV show and we're just having fun with this. But I think it will go somewhat to tell you about the character that Andy Griffith may have had, where he wanted that the extras there on the set to represent a broad cross section of people. So I want to thank Joe for writing that in. And Joe also, he had this very nice comment he posted over at the Who's Been Messing Up the Bulletin Board chapter digest. He posted it there by email, and here's what he had written in to say. He said, I had a chance last night to catch up on Alan's Two Chairs No Waiting podcast. I was about 3 sessions behind, so spending an hour there at Two Chairs No Waiting reminded me of spending an hour at a small town barbershop when I was growing up, which, like Two Chairs, was also a very fun place to be. He's going to go on here and describe some things that some of you, men mostly, I guess, but most of our listeners are men, I think. So you may remember some of these things as well. He says, as those memories became more vivid, and a few things come to mind that perhaps, things we cannot necessarily see or experience at Floyd's barbershop. So here's some things he remembered. Number one, the sight of the hair on the floor between the sweepings. Just kind of remember back when you was a kid and sitting in the barbershop, maybe even still today if you go to the barbershop. But this is at Floyd's or at your barbershop. Number two, the smell of hot shaving cream and various hair tonics. Sound of a straight razor being sharpened on that long leather strap. The sound of hydraulics as the barber pumps up that chair to lift the patron to the right height. And the sound of a radio or a TV droning in the background. This is just some background noise. The ever-present Coke or pop machine, depending on where you're from. And a stack of empty bottle crates where you slid those glass bottles in. And Joe says my barber used to let me empty out the bottle caps for whatever game Coca-Cola had going, and I felt like a rich man. He goes on fishing displays. He says my barber, he always had tried to explain fly fishing to me when I asked how these funny-looking little strings tied up to look like a bug served as bait. He persuaded me to stick with rubber worms and real worms, no tater salad, rather than use the flies for bait. The magazines sitting around in the barbershop, which Floyd, he always had enough to swing two chairs. Yeah. Popular Mechanics, Hot Rod Magazine, Field and Stream, Highlights. There was where someone usually circled the hidden pictures already. The sound of electric razor just inches from your ear. Oh, I remember that sound. Along with the things we did see at Floyd's barbershop, those are some things we didn't see. Here's some things we did see at Floyd's. National Geographic magazine. A row of nondescript chairs filled with gossiping men sitting around. We've seen that. A poster of various kinds of haircuts you could get. Mirrors and tables with tonics and witch hazel. A second barber chair, which is usually empty. Container of that liquid stuff that sanitizes combs. That blue stuff. And the candy stripe barber pole, but no chairs outside. Small town barbershop was a place that young boys enjoyed and heard lots of good stories, just like Two Chairs No Waiting. That's from Joe. And Joe, thanks for writing that in. And I guess I enjoyed that. Maybe it's because I have an affinity to Floyd the barber. But just listening to that story and remembering back when I was young, going to the barbershop and sitting there and just all those things, like the smell of that shaving cream or hair tonics or whatever it was just in the barbershop. I definitely remember that. Ladies, I'm sure you remember going to something similar to that and having those similar kind of things. So, maybe our lives are a little bit more like Mayberry than we realize, and maybe that's why we like it so much. But let's try to hold on to those memories and just keep that Mayberry feeling alive. And I think that's kind of what we were talking about last week, and I want to definitely encourage you to remember that again this week. Well, folks, hey, that's all the feedback we've got for the week, and I definitely would like to hear from you. As I said, you can drop me a voicemail at 684-8415, and I would love to hear from you. You can email me at floyd@mayberry.com. You can drop by twochairsnowaiting.com and leave a comment on any of the podcast episodes, and I'll see it. Or you can go over to facebook.com and you can leave me messages there as well. You go to facebook.com/2chairs and you'll see us there. So, folks, I want to thank you guys for coming. I want to thank you for being here, and I just want to invite y'all back next week for another episode of Two Chairs No Waiting, your Mayberry podcast. Bye, y'all.